Hi all, and welcome back to Walking on Cinders readings that I'm doing. I'm late again tonight, and the reason for that is that I went on a really long bike ride this afternoon. I've been isolated now for nearly a month myself, so I thought, I need to go out, and it's Good Friday. I'm off work, and I had the chance to do so. Of course, I respected social distancing. I didn't see anybody really that I could have sort of interacted with anyway, and I didn't stop as well. But 25 miles, very good in the end. So this is Walking on Cinders, and so apologies for being a little bit late this evening, but this is going to be the next reading from the book, and we're going to read chapter 17 of Walking on Cinders now. There's a small stretch of land that runs between the chained pews where the grass is long and the ground is flanked on either side by two tall mountains. It is a peaceful place where trees grow randomly wherever the seeds have fallen. The nature of such a landscape made it the perfect location for the headquarters of a reformed offensive against the French. At the far end of this hidden stretch, and behind a clump of tall evergreens, reformed troops had built a makeshift hut from fallen logs and branches. There were representatives here from all of the reformed countries, and many had developed their own language which they used to communicate. Many of the leaders spoke in English, but that was now considered the language of the enemy, and if you wanted to remain popular, you spoke anything but English and French. To build even this small, ramshackle one-room dwelling, the soldiers had to work in the dead of night, the black of their uniforms hiding them under the stars. The location was far enough away from the nearest United French barracks, on the far side of a mountain range, and there was no need to worry about being discovered. The French knew there were reformed troops in the area, but like all United forces, they would not launch an attack until necessary. However, it still took the reformed troops several long weeks to complete the dwelling between the trees. Now it was finished and ready for use. All factions of the reformed army within the immediate vicinity were marching towards the chained pews, ready for battle. The reformed forces in Europe were now thin on the ground, and their governments were in debt from the costs of such a prolonged offensive. But those in charge felt the end was near, and even at this late stage, a reformed victory remained certain. Chris made his decision in that split second. He was a soldier, and some had called him a born leader. He survived the carnage of a United jet crash, along with 3 other comrades, and he figured it must have been for a reason. He was going to fight as he had always done, with the fate of the world hanging in the balance. But first, he needed to be reunited with his comrades. Staff Sergeant Chris Aston and Major General Sir Adam Dutel were walking now rather more briskly, back along the paths that led towards the centre of the barracks. The private quarters were almost deserted. Everyone was preparing for the onslaught of defensive action. "I will be fighting for your side, sir," Chris said simply. The authority required for such a situation was with him. "But before I do, I want to find my comrades." The Major General turned to look at him, a grin appearing on his face. "Good choice, Christopher," he wheezed, his grin never fading. "I'm prepared for the approaching battle myself, as I'm sure you are. I shall collect Private Fisher, and I will give you a room in the quadrant from which you can organise yourselves. Your other friends will be directed there when they arrive." Chris thought about this for a moment. It sounded like a good idea, but how were Ewan and Jennifer to cross the barren plain, presuming they made it that far? Well, how would they cross safely to the barracks, he queried, realising his worst fears were following him, that again they might all face the threat of death. Surely they'll be captured, or worse, killed. This time the Major General didn't turn back. "Chris Aston," he replied thoughtfully, "you worry far too much. The plain is facing towards the chained pews. The barracks were designed so that the mountain range backed onto the private quarters. The front entrance is one of the safest in the complex." Chris chuckled to himself. "So, Christopher, if anything is destroyed at the height of the approaching battle, it should only be my collection of Van Gogh paintings. There would be no human sacrifice at all, at least not in the grounds of these barracks." The Major General seemed ready for anything. There were so many other questions that Chris wanted to ask him, but somehow it just felt inappropriate. As the pair rounded the final corner and headed towards the parade ground where Chris and Thomas had separated earlier in the day, every soldier in the barracks was turning out in full uniformed colours, hundreds of men lining up in a regimental pattern. At the front of the open courtyard, Chris saw a small wooden lectern, a microphone and a set of speakers. He was about to turn right and take his place with the other soldiers when the Major General spoke to him again. "I'm afraid you're going to have to come with me, Staff Sergeant," he said calmly, taking Chris's arm. "This address is rather important, and I feel you will be surprised as to what I have to say." Chris was unable to resist, and together they approached the lectern, aware of the noise of several hundred United soldiers that they could make in a confined space. They were all chatting amongst themselves, yet they kept a watchful eye on the front, awaiting their orders. Chris followed Dutel forwards, and suddenly there was a silence. "Attention!" shouted a voice from the left, and together the men saluted Major General Sir Adam Dutel. "Friends," Dutel began, his voice echoing around the quadrant like the great British leader Winston Churchill, "there are bleak times ahead. You will know this, for as many weeks we have been planning the inevitable battle that is to come. Reformed troops are now approaching faster than we first thought. In these dark days of war, we have been forced to implement our plans far sooner than we would have liked." Chris was not at all surprised by the Major General's oratory skills, but he felt more than a little nervous standing beside him, looking out over so many pairs of eyes. "I have assembled you here today to brief you on the way ahead and prepare you for the days to come. As I speak, reformed forces are descending on the Chain de Peuse, and now we know they have assembled a makeshift headquarters, somewhere in the immediate vicinity. These men are growing weak. Their governments are in grave debt, and if we can succeed in destroying their strongholds here and across the world, areas in which they are not familiar, which they do not call home, then we will be in with a very good chance of ending this terrible war once and for all. Do not misunderstand. This offensive will be dangerous, and you men will be fighting on the front line. But you will be protecting and fighting for the very future of these lands. What happens here, amongst the glorious mountains of the Chain de Peuse, will change the future of this world. Together we will surely see those who have wronged us brought down." The Major General stepped back from the lectern, and a great roar erupted from the regimented crowd. These soldiers had an obvious respect for their leader, and they hung upon his every word. Chris, meanwhile, had still received not the slightest clue as to why he was standing beside Dutel at the lectern. But all of his questions would soon be answered in one clear demand that would lead him in a definite direction. As Dutel began to speak, once more a hush descended over the crowd for a second time. Chris realised that they would now return to their old ways, fighting for their country against one enemy, as it had always been. "Well, men," Dutel's voice boomed, "my valiant men, you have both pride and courage in your souls. There is no way I could let you fight alone. We are 400 here in this complex, and you will be split into two groups to be led by the two most experienced officers I could possibly place in such a position. Together they will have a wealth of experience, individually, a pride that will not see one of your men fighting in vain. Now, those of you who are in companies A through D will be led by Commandant Jean-Andrew Babounou. Okay?" At the mention of this name, several shouts went up from the group as the soldiers to the left, and Chris watched as the tall, dark and imposing figure that he had run into earlier in the day approached the front of the quadrant. Seeing him in a fuller light, he looked more like a distinguished fighter, with many gleaming medals on his chest. The Major General was smiling broadly and waving at particular soldiers whom he recognised, as he welcomed Babinot to the stage. The man appeared to be held in as high regard as Dutel himself, and his manner was as arrogant as that of a man of a much senior rank. "A very warm welcome indeed for Commandant Babinot. He is a seasoned leader who will do well in battle. You can do no better than be under his command. For those of you in companies F through I have both an interesting and wholly fruitful surprise for you. Some of you may be aware of two British soldiers who arrived here earlier today. Many of you will have met Private Thomas Fisher. But as a great soldier as Thomas Fisher may be, he has a counterpart." By now, Thomas, who Chris had seen 3 rows in, appeared to have melted into the crowd of men, shying away from the limelight. Up to the lectern, for the first time in his life, Chris wished that he could be doing exactly the same. There was no escape for him. "I hope you will join me," the Major General continued, in welcoming my choice, a man of some years' experience, a talented leader, and a man I trust to bring you expert guidance in the dark days ahead, Capitan Chris Aston." For seconds there was a hideous silence. Chris was confused. Why had the Major General introduced him as a Capitan? He knew it was a French rank, but he was a British soldier. Why introduce him as anything else? A few muffled claps echoed around the buildings, but it was a far cry from the thunder of applause that had welcomed Chris's counterpart to the stage. He felt sick, quaking in his boots before a group of men for the first time in his life, and unable to understand what the Major General wanted of him. He wondered how he would ever be able to lead them to victory. But there was no need to worry, for as Chris looked out across the men who would soon be risking death, something remarkable happened. From the very centre of the group, Thomas Fisher had emerged from a gaggle of men and was looking up to his friend and comrade. "He is a born leader," he shouted, his voice ringing high above the silence. "He saved my life and the lives of others who I know you will meet in due course, and you will be proud to be led by Capitan Ashton when you realise that he has saved the lives of one of our most important and influential personalities." His face was red with effort, and he was laughing too. "Just you wait!" And then he began to clap, as loudly as he could, and soon others were joining him, welcoming this unknown man who had been chosen by Dutel and was willing to risk his life for them. And Chris couldn't help but smile back as 200 feet pounded against the ground to echoes of "Chris! Chris! Chris!" Commandant Babineau's face was a picture. He never contemplated being beaten on home soil, but now he truly was, and Chris appreciated that the days ahead would not be as hideous as perhaps they had first seemed. "Enough!" Major General Adam Dutel's voice roared suddenly, more happy than angry. The silence returned and the speakers crackled with his voice. "I knew you would take kindly to both of your leaders." He paused for a moment and acknowledged both Chris and Babineau before tightening his gaze. "Now, men, pay attention. Reformed troops are approaching fast. Their morale will be boosted by an increase in numbers, and the possibility, however slight, of a triumph in the battles to come. Before us are the glorious Chain de Poux. The night is beginning to draw in now, and beyond the private quarters, between us and the approaching enemy, is the fast-flowing river. You will know this, of course, and it will work in our favour. So get some rest now before we head out into the battlefield tomorrow. The enemy will not reach us before sunrise, of that I am confident." And with that, they began to disperse, heading off in small groups to their own bunkhouses. Chris was about to greet Thomas when he felt the Major General's clammy hand on his shoulder. "Well done, soldier," he whispered into Chris's ear, turning him around on the spot. "Nobody here need know about your past encounters with Colonel Smith. Merely do as you have always done." As he finished, Chris watched Babineau return. Thomas was walking patiently in his wake. "Thank you, Commander Babineau," Dutel smiled, and then he was dismissed. "Now, boys, like Colonel Smith, I feel that you are our future, the key, so to speak, of our intelligence force. A little while ago, I was in talks with the President of the United Isles of Great Britain about sending some high-quality soldiers to fight here in the mountains." Chris and Thomas looked at each other, lost for words, as they realised it was Dutel who had engineered their deployment and Colonel Smith who had taken the liberty in removing them. "I know it's late, but before we will allow ourselves a little rest, I need to show you the room that I have been promising, so that you know where it is if your friends were to arrive in the early hours of the morning, say." There was a mysterious twinkle in the Major General's eye as he led the two men away from a lectern towards a high wall on the far side of the quadrant. "I'm sure you will understand the sudden way in which I introduced you earlier, Capitan Ashton." Dutel continued as they walked. He seemed to enjoy referring to Chris by his new title. "As you are now serving in France, certain changes have to be made. I want you to lead 2 companies of men, and for that you must hold a certain rank. Therefore, I have bestowed on you the non-commissioned rank of Capitan, with your pay remaining at its original level." Chris wasn't sure, but he nodded anyway. Experience had taught him that when soldiers were given a non-commissioned rank, it was invariably hard for them to make the transition, continue to associate with their former comrades, or even be accepted by their new colleagues. Chris had a strange feeling there would be a certain animosity towards him now. When they reached the wall, they found a door which blended into its surroundings. Dark, damp and peeling, one that could easily have gone unnoticed if you had no need to use it. The room on the other side was empty, save for one large table and a single light bulb hanging from a ceiling cord. It looked not the least inviting, and Chris was not surprised. "I know it's a little bland at the moment," Dutel said, his smile fading, "but I will arrange for diagrams, posters and cabinets to be moved here from the war rooms. It will help you with your planning, I'm sure." Chris smiled weakly, and Thomas nodded. "Yes, sir," they said in unison. In truth, they were too tired for all of this now, and besides, the Major General had promised they would be reunited with Ewan and Jennifer before anything else took priority. "Well then, you know where it is," Dutel said meekly, wiping his brow and directing them out of the room. Shouldn't be too much of a problem when your friends arrive. He stopped outside the door and breathed in the fresh evening air. Things went well tonight, boys. Thank you. Finally, he pointed to the right and added, You'll be sleeping in that bunkhouse. Head off now. Private Fisher, you will show Chris Aston where to go. They nodded, and the small group parted company. You've got to tell me what's going on, Thomas breathed as they reached the entrance to the bunkhouse. Tomorrow, Thomas, his friend replied. When Ewan arrives and Jennifer, then we can talk about everything. And with that, they entered the small wooden building and found their bags waiting for them on the bunk beds that they were to share. So that's chapter 17 of my novel Walking on Cinders. I will be back tomorrow night and hopefully at the time of 6 p.m. to read you chapter 18 of the book. I'll see you then.